Pressure is mounting for Australia to change its National Day. Indigenous communities don't want it to fall on the 26th of January as it marks the arrival of the British.
Thousands have gathered across the country to oppose the celebrations. Some have called for the day to be abolished altogether. In Sydney, First Nations speakers held a rally to raise issues such as land rights and custodial deaths. Some of them called on protesters to vote against the government's proposed Indigenous voice to Parliament, calling it a whitewashed measure.
All right, for more, let's speak now to Martin Thomas. He's a professor of the School of History at the Australian National University. The professor, firstly, just how controversial and divisive is Australia Day, which is also variously referred to as Survival Day, Invasion Day, and Day of Mourning for the Australian society?
Yeah, it also used to be first known as First Landing Day. But I think it is deeply divisive. It's a difficult thing to celebrate this landing on the 26th of January, 1788. That's when the first convicts, the first fleet, arrived in Australia from Britain. And of course, it has terrible connotations for the Indigenous people. So to be marking that as the National Day, and a National Day surely should be a day of union and common celebration, you can see why Indigenous communities and their many supporters are highly irate.
Yes, highly irate. I understand the point of the point you're making, Professor. Just talk us through then how these protests have grown or evolved over the years, and does the fact that there are so many names for it make it actually quite difficult to focus a solution?
Well, look, it is difficult to find a solution because I think most people agree that there should be some sort of national day of celebration. Most nations have that. But as I said, Australia Day, the 26th of January, is really divisive, and it has been for a long time. I think certain fault lines in Australia Day, and part of that is that initially it was only celebrated in New South Wales because Australia is a federation and it is basically a merging of various colonies, 6 main colonies. And initially, when Australia Day was, or they called it Foundation Day early on, it wasn't of any relevance to Victoria, Tasmania, to the other states. And so it's only much later in its history, and particularly in 1938, when New South Wales staged a huge celebration on the 26th of January. And the federal government said that they'd provide funding, but they had to be called Australia's 150th anniversary celebration. It wasn't to be badged a New South Wales event. So even sort of quite apart from the Indigenous protest, it's always had certain fault lines, and it's always been trying to sort of wrangle these competitive relationships between colonies and then states. Then in 1938, with a huge regatta, with reenactments of the British arrival and a tall ship and all sorts of paraphernalia and pageantry, Indigenous Australians took immense objection to this. And so it was on 26th of January 1938 that the first day of mourning protest was held. So there's nothing new or recent about this. That protest has continued in various forms, over the very long period since the 1930s.
And Professor, while the majority of the Australians still believe that they should continue to have Australia Day on January 26th, the polls seem to show over the last few years that the attitudes have been sort of shifting towards changing the date. And in fact, some Australians are beginning to sort of distance themselves from the controversial day. What's your read into this trend? And do you expect overall support for Australia Day will sort of drop into minority over the next decade?
Well, actually, there's a poll in the Canberra Times today. It only polled 1,000 people, but it actually showed that there was a slight majority for changing the day. So it does seem that that's the way things are headed. It will be a divisive issue, and that there is a nationalist, I think a white nationalist element in this country who will vigorously defend this day. So it's not going to be resolved very pleasantly, I don't think. But I guess part of what we need to do now is start hunting around for other solutions. Wesley Enoch, who's a very well-known Indigenous playwright, has said in an editorial just in the last couple of days that we need to change the country first, and then that will provide guidance on how to change the day.
Well, new Prime Minister Anthony Albanese promised in his victory speech that a referendum to decide the Indigenous voice to Parliament be enshrined in Australia's constitution. That would be held within his term of office. Help us understand what that would mean.
This is a very big development indeed. And Anthony Albanese is still pretty new Prime Minister. He was elected in May last year, I think. And this is one of his driving issues for change. And in fact, the referendum for the change in the Constitution is going to happen this year. We haven't quite got a date for it yet, but that's what's been said. The idea of having this referendum is a response to a very special event that was held at Uluru, or Ayers Rock as it used to be known, in 2017. And Indigenous elders from throughout the country gathered there, and they produced a really remarkable statement, a manifesto of sorts, and also almost a piece of poetry, I think. It's called the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And it's a response to the grief, the destruction of culture and language, the high incarceration rate, and the many disastrous things that are going on for Indigenous people in Australia at the moment. And it's a suggestion, a proposal that what Australia needs to do to try to get on top of this is to have, as you say, a voice to Parliament, some probably elected representatives who will advise the government on Indigenous issues. And so this is, to do this requires change in the Constitution, and to do that in Australia is pretty tricky. You need a majority of yes votes throughout the country, and you need that in a majority of states. And so there have been lots of attempts to change the Constitution. Most of them have not been successful, and those that have been successful have always had support from across the political sphere.
All right, thanks very much, Professor, for your time this morning. Professor Martin Thomas, their School of History at the Australian National University.